I'm Carol Bacak-Egbo, historian for Oakland County Parks. Join me now for an episode of History in Our Parks.
Who was H. Smith? An Independence Oaks County Park mystery. In researching the history of Independence Oaks, I had learned a lot about some of the farms that used to be there. The Bellett's Farm, the Bailey Farm, the Baldwin Farm. But one little farm was a mystery. It was a 40-acre farm labeled simply H. Smith. I wanted to find out more about H. Smith. I started at the website for U.S. Land Records. This gives me an acreage report. Starting with the very first person to own the land, it will show everyone who's owned the land over time. That document showed me that in 1864, J. Allen sold those 40 acres to E. Smith. It took some detective work, but I learned that E. Smith was actually Eldad Smith. I learned that in 1856, Eldad Smith had married Esther Ann Hoyt, but she had gone by the name of Harriet. It turned out that H. Smith was most likely Harriet Smith. But it wasn't common for women to own land in the 1870s, and those who did had usually inherited it on the death of their husband. Now I had to find out what had happened to Eldad Smith. I learned that during the Civil War, he was a member of Company H of the 4th Michigan Infantry. A military record showed me he had enlisted in 1864. He'd been hospitalized for quite some time for measles and blood poisoning, and he'd been mustered out in 1866, and he'd returned home. Sadly, he had died just 7 months after returning home. His death was attributed to the blood poisoning he had contracted during the Civil War. This left young Harriet a widow, with 3 sons, ages 8, 3, and 1. In addition to this, she was 5 months pregnant at the time her husband died. Having few options, she did what most Civil War widows did. She remarried. She married William Griggs in 1869. Now, despite a lot of research, I could not find anything about William Griggs. I had wondered who he was. How had they met? Harriet would experience death one more time in 1874, when her 7-year-old daughter, Alta, died. This would have been the child she was carrying when her first husband, Eldad Smith, died. Then I found out that Harriet married a 3rd time in 1892 to William Cothrow, who was a blacksmith in Holly, Michigan. Now, this suggested that William Griggs had died by 1892, leaving her a widow for a 2nd time. But there was more to Harriet's story. And the new information came from the pension record of Eldad Smith, held in the National Archives. It turned out that Harriet Smith, in 1889, had applied for a widow's pension. Now, she was entitled to do this because she was a widow of a Civil War soldier. This meant that she must have applied after William Griggs, her 2nd husband, died. An affidavit where Harriet was trying to prove that she was indeed the widow of Eldad Smith stated this: Mr. Griggs married me under an assumed name, and I was not aware of it for nearly 5 years. During all the time I lived with him, he was ugly to me and treated me very cruelly, threatening to strike me, once jamming the door against my hand so that it broke my finger. Being married to him, I supposed I must live with him and stand his abuse. When I found that he had deceived me and married me under an assumed name, I immediately left him. With the help of her sons, Harriet was able to get a court to dissolve her marriage in 1884. This was why I hadn't been able to find anything out about William Griggs. He had married her under an assumed name. Had she found happiness finally in her 3rd husband, the blacksmith William Cothrow? I wish I knew. But I do know that in 1900 they were living in Grand Rapids with his daughter and his son-in-law. Harriet died in June of 1903, and William 6 months later. William is buried in Oak Hill Cemetery in Grand Rapids, Michigan, but Harriet is not there. I have a theory. I think I know where Harriet is buried. I think she's buried right down the road from Independence Oaks County Park at Seymour Lake Cemetery. That's the cemetery where Eldad Smith, her first husband, is buried, and his parents. I looked through the burial records for Seymour Lake Cemetery. It showed that the Smith family plot has 8 people buried in that plot. But there's only 2 tombstones, accounting for 3 burials. I think that Alta, the little girl who died at age 7 in 1874, I think she's buried there, buried in the family plot with her father and her grandparents. I also think that H. Smith, Harriet Esther Smith, is also buried in the Smith family plot with her husband and her child. One more piece of evidence. Harriet's death record gives her burial place as Clarkston, Michigan. That's frequently listed as the location of Seymour Lake Cemetery. So who was H. Smith? She was a Civil War widow whose life had been completely changed by the Civil War.